Eleanor Whitmore lifted the ring from her finger and set it on the silver tray without a single tremor in her hand. Across the crowded ballroom before 300 guests, the man she was to marry had just confessed his heart belonged to another woman. She did not weep. She did not beg. She turned, raised her chin, and walked through the silence as though it could not touch her. In that one moment, she lost her future, her name, and her family's protection. If you believe a woman's worth is hers alone to keep, subscribe. Stay with me to the very end, and tell me in the comments which city you're watching from, so I can see how far Eleanor's story travels. The music stopped because Charles Beaumont raised his hand, and a man like Charles Beaumont did not raise his hand for nothing. Eleanor stood beside him at the head of the Whitmore ballroom, her gloved fingers resting where they were meant to rest on the arm of the man her father had promised her to since she was 19. She was 22 now. She had learned in those 3 years to read the weather of a room the way her father read the weather over his tobacco fields. And the weather in that room had changed. "Friends," Charles said, and his voice carried the way it always carried, smooth and certain. "Neighbors, you have come a long way through the summer heat to share this evening with us." "Hear, hear," someone called from near the punch. Eleanor did not look at the man who'd called out. She was looking at Charles, at the small muscle that jumped along his jaw, at the way his eyes kept sliding past her toward the far side of the room. He had not met her gaze once since the dancing began. "My father always told me," Charles went on, "that a man must be honest before God and before his own conscience. And I find I cannot stand before all of you, before this fine family, and speak a vow I do not feel." A few uncertain laughs. They thought it was a speech. They thought it was charm. Eleanor knew it was not. "Charles," she said quietly, only for him, "what are you doing?" He did not lower his voice to answer her. He raised it. "I have tried," he said to the room, "to give my heart where my duty pointed. I have tried, and I have failed, and I will not compound that failure by marrying a woman while another holds everything I am." The laughter died. All of it at once, like a candle pinched between two fingers. Eleanor felt the silence settle on her shoulders like a second gown. She felt 300 faces turn. She felt her father somewhere behind her go very still. "Charles," she said again, and this time her voice did not shake, though something inside her had begun to fall a long way down. "You will stop now." "I cannot, Eleanor." He had the decency at least to look at her then. His eyes were wet, and she despised him for it, for the way he made his own betrayal into something he suffered. "Vivian," he said. And across the room, Vivian Carter stepped forward into the light. She came slowly, as though she had not rehearsed it, one hand pressed to her breast, her lashes lowered just so. "Charles," she breathed. "Oh, Charles, you mustn't." "I must." He left Eleanor's side. He crossed the floor in front of every guest who had toasted them not an hour before, and he took Vivian Carter's hand and he kissed it. "I have loved her since before I ever knew your name, Eleanor. I am sorry. I am so deeply sorry." A woman near the windows gasped. A glass set down too hard on a tray. Somewhere a fan snapped shut. And Eleanor Whitmore stood alone at the head of her father's house and understood with a clarity that was almost merciful that the next thing she did would be the only thing these people remembered of her for the rest of her life. She could fall. She could weep, and they would pity her, and pity was a thing you could not wash off. She could rage. She could call him the coward he was, and they would whisper that the Whitmore girl had no temper for a lady. Or she could do the one thing no one in that room expected a discarded woman to do. She could leave them nothing to talk about but her own composure. Eleanor reached up. She drew the glove from her left hand finger by finger slow, and the only sound in all that great room was the soft pull of silk. She slid the betrothal ring from her hand. She turned to the servant standing frozen at the edge of the floor with his silver tray of empty glasses, and she set the ring down upon it as though she were returning a borrowed cup. "Thank you," she told the servant gently, "for your trouble this evening." Then she looked at Charles Beaumont one last time. "I wish you joy of her," Eleanor said. "I reckon you'll need it." And she walked out. She did not hurry. That was the thing they would all remember, that the Whitmore girl did not hurry. She crossed the length of the ballroom with her chin level and her ruined glove folded over one wrist, and the crowd parted for her, the way water parts for a stone. And not one of them, not one in 300, had the courage to say a word to her, except one. He stood near the great doors at the far end, a tall man she did not know, broad through the shoulder, dressed plain and dark, in a room of peacocks. He had not been dancing. She had marked him earlier without quite meaning, to the way you mark the one still thing in a crowd. As she reached the doors, he stepped aside to let her pass, and he reached up and touched the brim of a hat. He was not wearing an old soldier's habit, that gesture done without thinking. "Ma'am," he said, low, just for her. Eleanor stopped. For one breath she let herself look at him. "Do I know you, sir?" "No, ma'am, you don't." His eyes were steady on hers, and there was no pity in them, and she was grateful past speaking for the absence of it. "But I'll tell you what I just saw, if you'll permit me." "I'm not certain I can bear to hear it." "You walked out of that room," the stranger said, with more dignity than every man who stayed in it. He paused. "Including the one who put you here." Eleanor's throat tightened in a way that Charles Beaumont's whole speech had not managed. "That's a kind thing to say to a woman who's just lost everything." "It ain't kindness, ma'am. It's the truth. I'm too old to confuse the two." And then he opened the door for her, and she stepped out into the warm dark of the summer night. And she did not learn his name, and she told herself she did not care to. His name was Nathaniel Ashford. She would learn it soon enough. The carriage ride home was 4 miles of silence, and her father broke it before they reached the gate. "You will turn this carriage around," Jonathan Whitmore said. Eleanor looked out at the dark fields. "I will not." "You will go back into that house, Eleanor, and you will smile, and you will tell that room it was a misunderstanding, a jest gone too far." He kissed her hand in front of the governor's wife father. I do not care if he kissed her on the church steps on Sunday morning. Her father's voice cracked like a whip in the small space. "Do you understand what you have done? Do you understand what walking out of that room has cost this family?" Eleanor turned to look at him. Then, and what she saw in her father's face frightened her more than anything Charles had done, because Jonathan Whitmore was not heartbroken for her. He was not even angry on her behalf. He was afraid. "What is it?" Eleanor said slowly. "What is it you're so afraid of, father?" "You will mind your tongue." "You stood in that room and watched a man shame me before 300 people, and your very first thought was to send me back to him." She felt the falling thing inside her settle into something colder, harder. "Why?" "Because the engagement was not about your happiness," her father snapped. "It was never about your happiness. You are a grown woman, Eleanor, not a child to be coddled with talk of love. What was it about?" He did not answer. "Father, what was it about?" Jonathan Whitmore looked out the window, and his jaw worked, and when he spoke again, his voice had gone quiet and bitter, in a way she had never heard from him. "The Beaumonts hold paper on this estate," he said. "On the land. On the house. On every acre your grandfather cleared with his own 2 hands." He turned back to her. "Your marriage was the price of forgiving it. Charles knew that. His father knew it. And tonight that boy stood up and tore it to pieces because some Carter girl batted her eyes at him." Eleanor sat very still. "You sold me," she said. "I secured your future. You sold me to settle a debt, and you didn't even—" Her voice failed her just once, and she made it obey. "You didn't even think I deserved to know the price of myself. That is enough." "How much, father?" "Eleanor. How much am I worth? I should like to know the figure. A woman should know what she fetched." Jonathan Whitmore raised his hand. He had never struck her in her life, and he did not strike her now, but he raised it, and they both saw it, and something between them that had been whole for 22 years tore clean down the middle and could not be sewn. He lowered his hand slowly. "You will be ruined," he said. "No respectable family will have you now. You have no fortune of your own, no protector, no name worth speaking. Do you understand that by morning every drawing room from here to Charleston will have heard that Eleanor Whitmore was thrown over for a mistress and hadn't the sense to weep about it? Then let them speak. They will speak for years. Let them speak for the rest of my life, Eleanor said, and to her own surprise she found she meant it. I would rather they speak of a woman who kept her own dignity than pity one who crawled back to a man who didn't want her. You raised me to be worth something, Father. You only forgot to tell me you'd already spent it. Her father said nothing more for the rest of the ride. When the carriage stopped, he went into the house ahead of her and did not look back. And a door closed, somewhere in the dark, and Eleanor stood alone in the front hall of the only home she had ever known and understood that it was no longer hers. It had never been hers. It had been collateral. She did not sleep. She sat at the window of her room, with the ruined glove still folded in her lap, and watched the summer dark go gray, and she did not weep because she had decided in the carriage that she was finished weeping for the convenience of men who would not weep for her. A little after dawn, her maid Hattie came up with a tray she had not asked for and set it down without a word and stood there twisting her apron. "Say it, Hattie," Eleanor said. "It ain't my place, Miss Eleanor. I've been told all night what my place is and isn't. I find I've lost my taste for it. Say what you came to say." Hattie's eyes were red. "There's already talk in the kitchen, miss. The grooms heard it from the Beaumont stables before sunup. They're saying—" She swallowed. "They're saying Mr. Charles and Miss Carter had an understanding long before your engagement was ever announced. Months before. That it was always meant to come apart, miss. That somebody wanted it to." Eleanor went very still. "Somebody wanted it to," she repeated. "That's the talk, miss." "And who profits?" Eleanor said slowly, more to herself than to the girl. "If a debt is forgiven, and a marriage is broken, and the daughter is too disgraced to ever speak against any of it." Hattie did not understand the question, but Eleanor was no longer asking her. She rose from the window. She crossed to the small writing desk in the corner, the one thing in this house that had truly belonged to her mother, and she sat down and drew out paper and trimmed her pen with steady hands. "Hattie, you said the grooms heard it before sunup, from the Beaumont stables." "Yes, miss. Then somebody at the Beaumont house was awake all night, same as me, making certain the story was told right before the truth could get its boots on." Eleanor dipped her pen. "I should like to know who." "Miss, what are you going to do?" Eleanor looked up, and for the first time since the music had stopped, something flickered in her face that was not grief and was not anger. Something quieter and far more dangerous. The look of a woman who has been handed the worst the world can do to her and discovered to her own astonishment that she is still standing. "They have already decided what I am, Hattie," she said. "A foolish girl who was thrown over and hadn't the sense to cry about it. A woman with no fortune, no name, and no one in the world to speak for her." She pressed the pen to the paper. "They are about to learn how badly they have misjudged the one thing they left me." "What's that, miss?" "My patience," Eleanor said. "And the fact that I was listening every single time they thought I wasn't." Outside, the first heat of the Virginia morning came down over the tobacco fields, and 4 miles away, a man named Nathaniel Ashford sat at his own breakfast table, turning over a column of figures he had memorized off a ledger. He was never meant to see figures that did not add the way the Beaumonts swore they added, and frowning at the place where they came up wrong. And Eleanor Whitmore, ruined, discarded, and entirely alone, began to write. The letter Eleanor wrote that morning was 3 sentences long, and she addressed it to no one she had ever met. She gave it to Hattie, sealed and unsigned. "There's a clerk at the courthouse in Richmond," she said. "A Mr. Pruitt. He worked for my grandfather 30 years ago before he went to the city. Mother used to send him a goose every Christmas until the day she died. He'll remember the name Whitmore. And if he don't miss, then I've lost a goose in a morning, and I'm no worse off than I was at midnight." Eleanor pressed the letter into the girl's hands. "Take it to the post yourself. Don't give it to a groom. Don't leave it on the hall table. Don't let my father see it. Can you do that?" Hattie looked at the unmarked seal a long moment. Then she tucked it into her apron and lifted her chin in a way that made Eleanor's chest ache, because it was the very gesture Eleanor herself had used in the ballroom not 12 hours past, and the girl had learned it watching her. "I can do that, miss." "Good girl." But Hattie did not leave. She stood twisting her hands, and at last she said, "Miss Eleanor, the whole county's going to know by supper. You sure you want to go poking at it? Some folks, when they fall, the kindest thing is to let 'em lie still a while." "I have been lying still for 22 years, Hattie." Eleanor turned back to the window and the brightening fields. "I find I have no more talent for it." By noon, the talent of the county was for something else entirely, and that was the savoring of a ruined woman. It came at her in pieces all that long afternoon, each one delivered with the particular tenderness of people who have decided to be sorry for you. The Pendletons sent a note canceling their invitation to the summer dinner, regretting that they would be from home the entire month, which was a thing that had never once been true of the Pendletons in July. The dressmaker in town returned the half-finished trousseau in a plain box with the bill paid in full, and a line at the bottom that said she did not expect Miss Whitmore would have further need of it. And Eleanor's own aunt, her mother's sister, the one woman in the world she might have hoped would come, sent her son. Instead, a boy of 16 who could not meet her eyes and stammered that his mother sent her love and her prayers and hoped Eleanor understood that she could not be seen calling at the house just now. "Of course," Eleanor told the boy. "Tell your mother I understand perfectly." She understood all right. She understood that her mother's own sister had weighed 22 years of family against one night's gossip and found the family wanting. She did not weep over that one either, though it cost her something not to. What she did instead was go down to the kitchen where the staff fell silent the moment she stepped through the door, all of them frozen in the act of pretending they had not been talking about her. "Sit down," Eleanor said. "All of you, please." No one sat. Cook clutched a wooden spoon to her chest like a shield. "I'll stand then." Eleanor folded her hands. "You've all heard what happened last night. I expect you heard most of it before I did. I came down to tell you that whatever my father has decided about my future, none of you are to suffer for it. If this house goes to the Beaumonts, and it may, I will see that each of you has a character written in my own hand and a month's wages besides whatever it costs me. You served my mother. You will not be turned out into the road over a man's cowardice." The kitchen was very quiet. "Miss Eleanor," Cook said finally, and her chin was trembling, "we heard the masters selling the South Fields come fall, to pay down the Beaumont paper. That true?" Eleanor had not heard it. She kept her face still. "Where did you hear that Beaumont's land agent was through the kitchen yesterday morning before the party, talking to the master in the study with the door shut? Walls in this house ain't thick, miss." "The day before the party." Eleanor turned that over. "The land agent had come the morning before Charles stood up in the ballroom and broke everything to pieces, which meant the negotiation over the South Fields had begun while Eleanor was upstairs being laced into a gown for an engagement that someone somewhere already knew would never happen." "Thank you, Cook," Eleanor said very evenly. "That is a great help to me." "It weren't meant as gossip, miss." "I know it wasn't. It was meant as loyalty, and I won't forget it." She paused at the door. "If the land agent comes again, I should be grateful to know of it." Quietly. She went back up the stairs with the South Fields turning in her head like a key that did not quite fit the lock, and she had reached the landing when the knock came at the front door. Not the timid knock of a boy sent with apologies, but 3 slow, deliberate strikes that carried through the whole house. She heard the footman open it. She heard a man's voice low and unhurried, and she knew it before she could put a name to it, knew it in her spine because it was the voice that had said ma'am to her in the doorway of a room where no one else had dared to speak. "I've come to see Miss Whitmore," Nathaniel Ashford said. "I'm afraid Miss Whitmore is not receiving, sir." "She'll receive me. Tell her it's about the man who put her where she's standing." Eleanor came down these stairs before the footman could climb them. Nathaniel stood in the front hall with his hat in his hands, and in the daylight he was less like a shadow and more like a man weathered grave somewhere past 30, with the kind of stillness that came to certain men only after they had seen enough to stop being startled by anything. He looked at her, and again there was no pity in it, and again she was glad. "Mr. Ashford," she said, "you have me at a disadvantage. I didn't learn your name last night, but you seem to have learned mine." "Half of Virginia knows your name this morning, ma'am. I'm sorry to say it." "Don't be. It's the truest thing anyone said to me all day." She came down the last step. "You told the footman you've come about Charles Beaumont. I've come about a column of numbers." He turned the hat slowly in his hands. "And I find they lead back to Charles Beaumont and his father, and a deal I think you ought to understand before another day goes by, because you're the one it's being made over, and you're the only one in it who doesn't seem to know the terms." Eleanor felt the floor of her chest go cold and steady, the way it had in the carriage. "You'd better come into the parlor, Mr. Ashford." "Your father at home." "My father," Eleanor said, "is the last person I want to hear what you have to say." A muscle moved at the corner of Nathaniel's mouth that in another man might have been the beginning of a smile. "Then the parlor it is." She did not offer him tea, and he did not seem to expect it. They sat across from each other, and Nathaniel set his hat on his knee and got to it without ceremony, the way she was already learning he got to everything. "You know your father owes money to the Beaumonts. I learned it last night, in a carriage, rather later than I'd have liked. You know how much? He wouldn't tell me the figure. He said a woman shouldn't trouble herself." Nathaniel was quiet a moment. "It's $11,000, ma'am." Eleanor did not move, but the number landed in her like a stone dropped down a well, and she counted the silence before she heard it hit bottom. $11,000. It was a sum to buy a plantation. It was a sum no tobacco crop in 3 bad summers running could ever hope to clear. "That can't be right," she said. "My father's not a reckless man. He's never gambled, never speculated." "He didn't gamble it, ma'am. He was lent it, slow over 4 years. A little here, when the crop came short, a little there, when the price of leaf fell out from under him. Each time the Beaumonts were generous. Each time they only asked the smallest thing in return. A signature, a parcel of land set as surety. Your grandfather's bottomland down by the river the 3rd time." Nathaniel's voice did not change, but something behind it tightened. By the 4th year, there wasn't much left to set down but the house itself, and by then, they didn't need to ask for the house. They had something better. "Me," Eleanor said. "You," he agreed. She looked at her own hands folded in her lap, the left one bare now, where the ring had been. "How do you come to know all this, Mr. Ashford? You're not a Beaumont. You're not a Whitmore. You stood in the back of that ballroom like a man at a funeral he wasn't sure he was welcome at." For the first time something crossed his face that was harder to read. "I hold paper too," he said. "On the Beaumonts. Old Beaumont came to me 18 months ago wanting to borrow against his cotton, same as your father borrowed against his leaf, and I lent it because that's what I do. I lend money to men who own land, and I take my interest and I sleep fine at night because I deal fair, and I don't lend a man more rope than he can climb back up. But 3 weeks ago, Beaumont's man brought me a ledger to look over to satisfy me the cotton would cover the note." He paused. "And the numbers didn't add. Money was coming in that didn't come from any field I could find. $11,000 of it, ma'am, listed as an asset, listed as good as collected, due to be made whole this very month. And next to it in another man's hand was written one word." "What word?" "Marriage." The parlor was so quiet Eleanor could hear the clock in the hall and her own pulse beneath it. "They were counting my marriage as money already in their pocket," she said slowly. "Money they could borrow against, money they'd already spent. That's the size of it. Then why?" And here, for the first time in the conversation, Eleanor's composure cracked just at the seam, just enough for the bewilderment to show through. "If my marriage was worth $11,000 to them, why in God's name did Charles stand up last night and throw it away in front of 300 people? You don't burn down a house you're about to inherit, Mr. Ashford. It makes no sense." And Nathaniel Ashford looked at her steadily across the small space between them and said the thing that turned the whole night inside out. "Unless," he said, "burning it down was worth more than the house." Eleanor stared at him. I don't understand. Neither did I at first. He leaned forward, the hat forgotten on his knee. Think on it, ma'am. The debt's collateralized against your father's land, the bottom land, the south fields, the house itself. As long as the debt stands, the Beaumonts can call it in any time they please and take the land at their own price. The marriage forgives the debt. The marriage makes you and Charles one household, makes your father's land safe, makes the whole thing settle out clean and fair. He let that sit. Now, who profits if the marriage doesn't happen? Eleanor's mind moved faster than her breath could keep up with. If the marriage doesn't happen, the debt isn't forgiven. The debt stands, and if the debt stands, they can call it in. They can take the land. At their own price, Nathaniel finished. $11,000 of debt against land worth 3 times that, and a ruined daughter too disgraced to make a sound when they come to collect, and a father too ashamed of how he got into it to fight them in any court in the state. He sat back. Your engagement was never going to end in a wedding, ma'am. I'd stake my life on it. It was always going to end exactly the way it ended last night. The only question was whether they could make it look like Charles's broken heart instead of Beaumont's broken word. And they did. Lord, but they did it well. But they did. Eleanor rose from her chair. She walked to the window. She stood with her back to him and her bare hand pressed flat against the warm glass, and she made herself think it all the way through to the end, past the humiliation, past the betrayal, all the way down to the cold floor of it. Vivian Carter, she said. Ma'am, you said Charles had to make it look like his own broken heart. He couldn't simply jilt me. A man who jilts a woman for money is a scoundrel, but a man who jilts her for love is only weak, and the county forgives weakness in a handsome man. She turned around. He needed a woman. A woman beautiful enough that no one in that room would question why he'd thrown me over for her. A woman willing to stand up in front of 300 people and play the part of the great love he couldn't deny. Vivian Carter, Nathaniel said. How much do you suppose does a woman charge for a performance like that? More than $11,000 if she's clever. And by every account, ma'am, Vivian Carter is the cleverest woman in the state. Eleanor laughed, then one short, disbelieving breath of a laugh that had no humor in it at all. She humiliated me before everyone I have ever known. She let me stand there and watch the man I was promised to kiss her hand. And it was a part she was paid to play. I don't know that she was paid in money, Nathaniel said carefully. Women like Vivian Carter, ma'am, they don't always trade in money. Sometimes they trade in position. A girl with a fine face and no fortune of her own, she might do a great deal to become Mrs. Charles Beaumont in earnest once the inconvenient first fiancé was out of the way. Then she's a fool, Eleanor said flatly. Because a man who'll burn one woman to the ground to save his family's land will do the very same to her the day she stops being useful. That, Nathaniel said, is the first thing either of us has said all afternoon that I'd bet money on. They sat with it a moment, the truth of it laid out between them, like a hand of cards turned face up. And then Eleanor did the thing that would set the whole rest of it in motion, the thing that would carry her out of the wreckage of one night and into something far larger and far more dangerous. She sat back down across from him and she folded her hands and she said, Why have you told me this? Mr. Ashford? He blinked as if it were not the question he'd expected. Because it's the truth and you've a right to it. That's a noble answer. It isn't the whole one. Eleanor watched him the way she had once watched the weather of a ballroom. You hold 18 months of paper on the Beaumonts. If they collect $11,000 off my father's ruin, that's $11,000 more they can use to pay you, and you're made whole, and you go home and sleep fine as you say you do. So I'll ask you again, and this time I'd be obliged if you'd answer plain. What is it you want? For a long moment, Nathaniel Ashford said nothing at all. He looked at her with something in his face that had not been there before. Not pity, never pity, but a kind of careful reassessment. The look of a man who has reached for a teacup and found a blade. They lied to me, he said finally. When Beaumont's man brought me that ledger, he swore on his father's grave that the $11,000 was good money collected fair. He sat in my house and ate my bread and lied to my face and used my own loan to finance the ruin of a girl who never did him a day's harm. His jaw set. I lend money, Miss Whitmore. I don't break people for it. And I will not be made a party to a thing like this without my knowing in my name with my money. That's what I want. I want it set right. He paused, and something in him gentled just slightly around the edges. And I'll own there's a piece of it that's plain selfish. I sat in the back of that room last night fully expecting to watch a foolish girl fall apart. I watched something else instead. I watched a woman take the worst night of her life and walk through it like she'd been training for it since birth. I don't see that often, ma'am. A thing like that, when you see it, you don't much want to stand by and watch it get crushed. Eleanor held his gaze, and for the second time that day, something rose in her throat that no act of Charles Beaumont's had been able to summon. I told you last night that was a kind thing to say to a woman who'd lost everything, and I told you it wasn't kindness. It was the truth. He stood and gathered his hat. I haven't changed my mind on that. But I'll tell you something else, Miss Whitmore, before I go, and you can make of it what you will. There's a way to fight this. It's a hard way. It means letting the whole county go on believing you're a ruined girl who hasn't the sense to cry for weeks yet, maybe months, while you gather what you need to prove the rest. It means letting them all be wrong about you for a good long while. Most folks can't bear that. Most folks would rather be pitied today than proved right next year. He set the hat on his head. But I watched you walk out of that ballroom, and I don't think you're most folks. Eleanor rose to see him out. At the parlor door, she stopped him with a hand that did not quite touch his sleeve. What do I need, Mr. Ashford, to prove the rest? You need the original ledger, not Beaumont's copy, the one with the word marriage written in it in the hand of whoever planned this. You need to know who that hand belongs to. And you need at least one person who'll stand up and say before witnesses that the broken engagement was arranged before it was ever announced. He looked at her. You find me those 3 things, ma'am, and I'll find you the rest. I've money, and I've patience, and I've a long memory for men who lie to my face. And in return, Nathaniel said, you don't owe me a thing. That's the part I expect you'll have the hardest time believing. But it's the truth, and I'm too old to confuse it with anything else. He tipped his hat, and he was gone, and Eleanor Whitmore stood in the doorway of her father's parlor, with 3 things to find, and a county full of people who had already decided she was finished. She had never felt less finished in her life. The first of the 3 things came to her sooner than she had any right to expect, and it came wrapped in the worst grief she had felt since her mother died. It was Hattie who brought it 4 days later, white-faced the morning after Eleanor's letter to the Richmond clerk would have arrived. Miss Eleanor, Mr. Pruitt's clerk wrote back already, came on the early post. She held out a thin letter. But miss, there's another thing. I went down to fetch it from the village myself like you said, quiet. And while I was waiting at the post, I heard 2 of the Beaumont grooms talking, and they didn't know me for yours. Miss, they said old Mr. Beaumont's sending Mr. Charles north to Philadelphia. Day after tomorrow. Says the air down here's gone bad for him. She swallowed. They're getting him out of the county, miss, before anybody starts asking the questions you're asking. Eleanor took the letter, but she did not open it yet. Day after tomorrow. Yes, miss. Then I have a day. She broke the seal on the clerk's letter and read it standing in the hall, and Hattie watched her face change, watched the careful stillness she'd worn for 4 days crack open around the eyes. Miss, what's it say? It says, Eleanor read slowly, that Mr. Pruitt remembers my mother fondly and is sorry for my trouble. And it says, her voice caught. It says that when my grandfather set up the estate, he did not leave it to my father at all. He left the bottomland, the river parcel, in trust, to his daughter, to my mother, and from my mother, by the terms of the trust, to her daughter. She looked up. To me, Hattie. The bottomland was never my father's to pledge against any debt. It was mine. It has been mine since the day my mother died. Hattie's mouth fell open. Then the Beaumonts, when they took it as surety, they took land that didn't belong to the man who pledged it. Eleanor's hands had begun to shake, and she let them, because for once the shaking was not grief or fear, but something hot and rising and clean. My father pledged my inheritance to cover his own debt without my knowing, without my mother's trust ever being read out to me, and the Beaumonts took it, and now they mean to collect on it. She folded the letter against her breast. And every man involved in it has spent 4 days believing I was too foolish and too disgraced to ever find out. Miss Eleanor. Hattie's voice dropped to a whisper. If that's true, if that land's yours, then your daddy didn't just sell you to a man. He stole from you to pay for it. The word hung in the hall between them. Stole. It was a hard word to set against a father, and Eleanor felt the full weight of it, felt the last bright thread of the man who had carried her on his shoulders through the tobacco rows when she was small, snap clean and fall away. Yes, she said quietly. He did. She did not have long to grieve it, because there was a man leaving for Philadelphia in 2 days who held a piece of the truth she needed, and once he was gone behind the safe stone walls of his father's northern connections, she might never get near him again. And so Eleanor Whitmore did a thing that would have been unthinkable to the girl she had been a week ago, the girl who waited to be chosen. She went to find Charles Beaumont herself. She did not go to the front of the house. She knew better than that now. She sent Hattie ahead with a careful word to a Beaumont kitchen maid who'd grown up 2 farms over and owed Hattie a kindness, and the word came back that Mr. Charles rode out alone every evening at dusk along the river road to be away from his father's questions, and that if a body wanted to come upon him without the whole house knowing, the river road at dusk was where a body would do it. So that is where Eleanor went alone on horseback the evening before he was meant to leave, with her mother's letter folded inside her glove. She found him where the road bent away from the water. He saw her and reined in hard, and the color went out of his face all at once. Eleanor, my God, you can't be here. If my father— Your father isn't here, Charles. It's only us. The way it used to be before you found you couldn't bear me. She brought her horse up beside his calm, unhurried. I'm not here to make a scene. I made enough of one for both of us, didn't I, walking out of that room without crying? You all thought I'd cry. I never wanted— He stopped. He looked for a moment like the boy she'd known at 19, the one who hadn't yet learned how much easier it was to be weak. I never wanted it to be that way, Eleanor. You have to believe that. I believe you didn't want to do it, Eleanor said. That's not the same as believing you didn't do it. You stood up in front of 300 people, Charles. You kissed her hand. Vivian. His jaw worked. You don't understand. Then make me understand. You're leaving tomorrow. You'll be gone north, and I'll be ruined here, and we'll likely never speak again as long as we both live. So tell me the truth one time, Charles, just once, since you'll never have to face me again. Did you love her, Vivian Carter? Was that the truth at least? And Charles Beaumont, who was weak, but who was not at bottom cruel, looked at the woman he had destroyed and could not hold her gaze. No, he said. The word came out of him like something pulled. No, I didn't love her. God help me, Eleanor, I hardly know her. My father— He pressed the heel of his hand to his eyes. My father arranged it, all of it, months ago. He told me what I had to do and how I had to do it, and he told me that if I didn't, we'd lose everything. The house, the land, all of it, and that your father had as good as agreed that it was the only way out for both families, that you'd be provided for, that you'd— His voice broke. He said you'd hardly suffer at all. He said a clean break in public was kinder than a long engagement that died slow. He said you were strong enough to bear it. He laughed, and it was an awful sound. He was right about that at least. You bore it better than I did. Eleanor sat very still on her horse and let him say all of it, every word, because she understood with the cold, clear part of her mind that was always working now that this was the second of the 3 things Nathaniel had named. Someone who'll stand up and say the engagement was arranged before it was announced. And here it was falling out of Charles Beaumont's mouth on a river road at dusk, unprompted, the whole shape of the thing. Your father arranged it, she repeated, with Vivian Carter and with mine. With yours. Charles looked up miserable. Eleanor, your father knew. Of course he knew. He couldn't pay the debt. This was the only way the books came clean for everyone. Mine got the... He stopped. Got the what, Charles? Eleanor's voice was very soft. Finish it. You've come this far. Your father got what? And here, Charles Beaumont made the mistake that men like Charles always make at the end, which is that having begun to tell the truth, he could not find the place to stop. The land, he said. The bottom land. The river parcel. That's what the whole thing was for. Not the marriage was just how it was supposed to look. My father wanted the riverland. He's wanted it for years. It's the only good water access for 10 miles, and your grandfather never would sell it to anyone. So when your father came begging for money, my father saw his chance. He'd lend and lend until the only thing left to take was the bottom land, and then... He stopped again, and this time the horror of what he was saying seemed finally to reach him. Then he'd take it, either through the marriage slow and clean, or through the broken engagement fast and dirty with you too ruined to fight, and your father too ashamed to. Eleanor felt the whole thing close around her at last, like a hand closing into a fist. The debt, the marriage, the public humiliation built to look like love. Vivian Carter paid in position to play her part. Her father's signature pledging land that was not his to pledge. And under all of it, the real prize, the thing they had been reaching for the whole time, the riverland her grandfather cleared with his own 2 hands and left in trust to her. Charles, she said, and her voice was so calm it frightened him more than weeping would have. Did your father know the bottom land wasn't my father's to pledge? Charles went white. What? The river parcel. The land you all built this whole ruin to steal. My grandfather left it in trust. To my mother. And to me. It has been mine, Charles, by law since the day my mother died. My father had no more right to pledge it against your family's loan than he had to pledge the courthouse or the church. She watched the truth of it land in his face. So I'll ask you again. Did your father know? I don't. Eleanor, I swear to you I never. Because if he knew, Eleanor said, then this wasn't a hard bargain between 2 desperate families. It was theft. Plain theft, dressed up in a betrothal and a broken heart. And the man who plotted it, and the woman who performed it, and the father who signed it all away, every one of them stood in that ballroom and watched me walk out, and every one of them is going to learn that the foolish, ruined girl they all felt so sorry for owned the very ground they were fighting over the entire time. Charles Beaumont stared at her on the dusk road like a man who has just understood far too late that he has been standing on a trapdoor. What are you going to do? He whispered. Eleanor gathered her reins. For a moment she looked at him. Truly, looked at him, this weak, handsome boy who had been the price of her humiliation and was now without his ever meaning to be the witness to her vindication. You're leaving for Philadelphia in the morning, she said. Go, get clear of it. I won't stop you, and I won't name you if I can help it, because whatever else you are. Charles, you told me the truth tonight when you didn't have to, and I find I'm not the sort to forget a thing like that. She turned her horse. But you'll do one thing for me before you go. Anything, God, Eleanor, anything. Write down what you told me. Tonight, all of it. Your father's plan, the timing, the riverland. Vivian's part in it. Write it in your own hand and sign it and have it witnessed by someone who isn't your father, and send it to a man named Nathaniel Ashford before you cross the state line. She looked back at him over her shoulder. You burned my whole life down to look like a man with a broken heart, Charles. Now you're going to put it on paper and look just once like a man with a conscience. It's the cheapest thing I'll ever ask of you, and it's the only thing that might let you sleep at night for the rest of your life. She rode off into the falling dark and did not look back to see whether he wept, though she thought from the sound that followed her down the river road that he likely did. 2 of the 3 things then. The trust which made the land hers in law, and Charles's confession which named the plan and the men behind it. There remained only the last and the hardest. The original ledger, the one with the word marriage written in the hand of whoever had planned the whole thing, because a confession could be denied, and a trust could be tied up in courts for years. But a ledger in a man's own hand, with the price of a woman's ruin written out in a column like the cost of seed corn, was a thing no amount of cleverness could explain away. And the ledger Eleanor knew was in old Mr. Beaumont's study, behind a locked door, in a house that wanted her destroyed. She was lying awake, turning over how a ruined woman with no fortune and no protector might get into a locked study in an enemy's house when the third thing came to her. Not as she'd expected it, not as a thing she had to seize, but as a thing that walked up to her front door of its own accord and asked very prettily to be let in. It was Vivian Carter. She came at mid-morning 2 days after Charles had ridden north in a borrowed carriage and a gown a shade too fine for a morning call, and she sent up her card, and Hattie brought it to Eleanor's room with an expression of such open outrage that Eleanor nearly laughed. "Miss Eleanor, you don't have to see her. You say the word, and I'll tell her you're from home. I'll tell her you're sick. I'll tell her you've gone to the moon." No. Eleanor was already rising, already smoothing her skirts, already feeling that cold, steady floor settle back beneath her. "No, Hattie, I will see her. Show her into the parlor. And Hattie—" She caught the girl's arm. "Bring the tea yourself. Stay near the door. And whatever you hear, whatever she says to me, you say nothing, and you remember everything. Can you do that?" "I can do that, miss." Hattie's chin came up. "I've been doing that my whole life." Vivian Carter rose when Eleanor entered the parlor, and she did it gracefully, and she wore an expression of such tender, brimming sympathy that a person who did not know better might have wept at the sweetness of it. "Eleanor." She came forward with both hands out. "Oh, my dear, I had to come. I couldn't bear to think of you here alone with everyone being so cruel. I had to tell you myself how dreadfully sorry I am for all of it." Eleanor did not take the offered hands. She sat down, and after a moment, when it became clear that no embrace was coming, Vivian sat too, smoothing her face back into its perfect grief. "That's a long way to come," Eleanor said, "to tell a woman you're sorry for a thing you helped to do." A flicker. Just a flicker behind the lovely eyes. Then it was gone. "I don't know what you mean," Vivian said gently. "I know how it must look, dearest. I know the whole county is whispering. But Charles and I, what's between Charles and I, we never meant for it to hurt you. The heart simply doesn't ask permission, Eleanor. You'll understand that someday when you love someone the way I love him." "Charles is in Philadelphia." "He needed time. We both did. It's all been so painful. He left 2 days ago," Eleanor said, "and before he went, he told me everything." The flicker came back, and this time it stayed. "I don't know what you think he told you. He told me your father didn't arrange this. His did. He told me the marriage was never meant to happen, that the whole engagement was built to come apart in public, so that the Beaumonts could call in my father's debt and take the Riverland. He told me you were brought in to play the great love, so it wouldn't look like the theft it was." Eleanor watched her. "He told me you did it for position, Vivian. To become Mrs. Charles Beaumont, once the inconvenient first fiancé was disposed of. Was that the price? Or did they pay you in something you could spend?" Vivian Carter's face did a remarkable thing then. The grief slid off it entirely all at once, like a mask coming away, and what was underneath was not anger and was not shame. It was amusement. "My," she said softly, and her whole voice had changed, dropped its sweetness, gone cool and clean and sharp as a blade. "He really did tell you everything, didn't he? The little fool. I told them he hadn't the spine for it. I told them he'd crack the moment someone looked at him kindly." She tilted her head, studying Eleanor with frank, almost approving curiosity. "And here I came to find out how much you knew, and you've gone and saved me the trouble. You're cleverer than they said. They all said you were a quiet little thing, decorative, easy. They were wrong. They were very wrong." Vivian settled back entirely at her ease now, as if the dropping of the mask were a relief to her. "All right, Eleanor. Since we're being honest, and since you can't prove a word of it, and we both know that's the truth, let me tell you how the world actually works because somebody clearly never bothered. Yes, I played my part. I played it beautifully, and I'd do it again tomorrow because I have a face and a name, and not $1 to put behind either. And a woman in my position takes the chances the world hands her, or she ends up a governess in someone else's house, wiping someone else's children's noses until she dies. You had everything I'll never have. A father, a home, a future handed to you in a settlement. You'd have married Charles and been bored and comfortable for 40 years and never once known how lucky you were. Her smile was almost pitying now and far more genuine than the grief had been. I took it from you, and the only reason you're sitting there looking at me like that instead of weeping into your tea is that you still think there's something you can do about it. There isn't. A trust you can't afford to defend a confession from a coward halfway to Pennsylvania, a debt that's perfectly legal on its face. You've got nothing, Eleanor, but the truth. And the truth, my dear, is the cheapest thing in the world. Everybody has one. Almost nobody can make anyone believe it. For a long moment, Eleanor did not answer. She let Vivian Carter sit there in her too fine gown, pleased with herself, certain she had won. Certain she had come into the house of a beaten woman and confirmed the beating. Then Eleanor reached over and rang the little bell on the side table. "Hattie," she said when the girl appeared in the doorway. "Miss Carter is just leaving. Will you see her to her carriage?" Vivian rose, gathering her shawl, still half smiling. "I'm glad we understand each other, Eleanor. There's no sense in either of us pretending." "How long," Eleanor said, "have you been standing in that doorway, Hattie?" Hattie did not even hesitate. "Since you rang for the tea, Miss Eleanor, the whole while." "And did you hear what Miss Carter said about playing her part and doing it again tomorrow and being brought in to make a theft look like love?" "Every word, miss." Hattie looked Vivian Carter dead in the eye, this poor girl in a plain apron, and she did not look away. "Every single word." The smile fell off Vivian's face for the second and last time. "A servant's word," she said. But there was a thread of something new in her voice, now. Something Eleanor had been waiting 4 days to hear. "A servant's word against mine. You think anyone will take the word of a kitchen girl over—" "They might not," Eleanor agreed. "Over yours. But Hattie isn't the only one who heard you, Vivian." She rose and walked to the parlor's far door, the one that led to the small back sitting room, and she opened it. "I find I learned a great deal from the way this whole thing was done to me. I learned that the trick of it is never to be the only witness. You taught me that yourself the night you made certain 300 people watched Charles kiss your hand." Nathaniel Ashford stepped out of the back sitting room with his hat in his hand and his face like stone. "Miss Carter," he said, "I believe I heard you say you'd do it again tomorrow." Vivian Carter stood frozen between the servant in the doorway and the moneylender by the wall, and for the first time since she had stepped forward into the light of the Whitmore ballroom, she had no idea at all what part to play. "You," she said. "Me." Nathaniel turned the hat slowly in his hands. "I hold the paper on the Beaumonts, ma'am. 18 months of it. And I came here this morning at Miss Whitmore's invitation to hear with my own ears whether what her young man wrote me from the road was true. It seems it was. Every word like the girl says." He looked at Eleanor, and something passed between them that had no name yet, but would have one before the summer was out. "I'd say that's the matter settled, Miss Whitmore. You found me your 3 things faster than any man I ever did business with. 2 of the 3 Mr. Ashford." Eleanor turned back to Vivian Carter, and her voice was very calm and very clear, and it carried all the cold, steady weight of a woman who has stopped entirely being afraid. "There's still the ledger, the original, the one with the price of my ruin written out in a man's own hand." She came a step closer to the woman who had destroyed her. "And you're going to tell me, Vivian, exactly where in old Mr. Beaumont's study he keeps it. Because the way I reckon it, you can be the woman who helped me set this right, or you can be the only one left holding it when the truth comes out and the men all run for cover the way men always do. Charles has run already. The Beaumonts will run the moment they see which way the wind's blowing. And you'll be standing there alone, my dear, the woman who did the deed in front of 300 witnesses with no fortune and no name, and no one in the world to speak for you." She let that sit exactly the way Nathaniel had taught her to let things sit. "You told me the truth is the cheapest thing in the world," Eleanor said. "You're about to find out what it costs." And Vivian Carter, who had a fine face and a fine name, and not $1 to put behind, Either looked from the servant to the moneylender, to the woman she had wronged, and understood at last that she had walked of her own free will and her own great cleverness straight into the one room in Virginia where her performance was worth nothing at all. Vivian Carter did not break that morning. Eleanor had not expected her to. A woman who could stand before 300 people and weep on cue did not surrender to one servant and one moneylender in a parlor. However neatly, the trap had closed. "You think you've caught something," Vivian said, gathering her composure, the way another woman might gather a dropped fan smoothly, as if it had never slipped. "A servant who'll say whatever her mistress feeds her. A lender protecting his own money. That's not proof, Eleanor. That's two people who want a thing to be true." She drew her shawl up over her shoulders. "Good morning to you, Mr. Ashford. I'll see myself out." "Sit down," Eleanor said. "I beg your pardon. I said sit down, Vivian. You came here this morning to learn how much I knew, and you've learned it, and now you're frightened, and a frightened person runs for the door. But you're going to sit down, because I haven't told you yet the one thing that ought to frighten you most." Something in Eleanor's voice did what no threat had done. Vivian sat. "You came here," Eleanor went on, "because you were sent, not by Charles. Charles is halfway to Pennsylvania and useless to anyone. By old Mr. Beaumont. He wanted to know whether the quiet little Whitmore girl had started asking questions. He sent you because you're clever, and because nobody would think twice about a rival paying a call of sympathy." She tilted her head. "But here's the thing he didn't reckon on, Vivian, and it's the thing you didn't reckon on either. If he sent you to find out what I know, then he doesn't know yet himself, which means there's still time, which means the ledger is still sitting in his study where he keeps it because he hasn't yet had cause to burn it." Eleanor leaned forward. "You've just told me he's still comfortable, still sure of himself, still careless, and careless men leave their account books exactly where they always leave them." The color moved in Vivian's face. She had given it away, the calling itself had given it away, and she knew it. "Even if that were so," she said slowly, "you'll never get near it. He keeps the study locked. He keeps the key on his own person. And he is not, I assure you, in the habit of inviting ruined women into his house to browse his private papers." "No," Eleanor agreed. "He's not, but he is in the habit of inviting them to dinner when there's something he wants from them." Nathaniel looked up sharply. "Miss Whitmore, hear me out." Eleanor did not take her eyes off Vivian. "Mr. Beaumont wants the Riverland. He's wanted it for years, and his whole scheme was built to take it cheap. But the scheme's gone sideways now, hasn't it, Vivian?" Charles fled instead of staying to brazen it out. "I walked away with my dignity instead of dissolving into a scandal he could manage. And I haven't crawled to anyone for help, which means he can't be sure what I've found out. A careful man in his position would want to settle the matter quietly. Pay me off, maybe. Frighten me off. Or," she paused, "buy the land outright fast before the law could be brought into it with a fair-looking offer I'd be a fool to refuse. He'd want a meeting, a private one, across a table, in his own house where he feels safe." "And you mean to give him that meeting," Nathaniel said. "I mean to make him beg me for it." Eleanor finally turned to him. "Mr. Ashford, you hold his paper. Tomorrow you're going to call on old Mr. Beaumont and tell him you've grown nervous about your loan. Tell him you've heard ugly talk about how he means to collect the Whitmore debt and that you'll not have your money tangled up in a scandal that lands in the courts. Tell him you want the whole thing settled clean within the month, or you'll call in your own note and take your cotton and be done with the Beaumonts forever." She watched it land. "He can't afford to lose you. He's borrowed against money he hasn't collected yet. If you pull out, the whole house of cards comes down before he's got his prize. So he'll do the only thing he can. He'll move fast to settle with me. And when he does, I'll insist gently, like a frightened girl who only wants it over with, that we meet at his house. To sign, with my own lawyer present for propriety's sake." "You don't have a lawyer," Vivian said. "I'll have one by then." Eleanor's mouth curved just slightly. "And while old Mr. Beaumont and his men are busy at the front of the house congratulating themselves on stealing my land for the second time, my lawyer is going to need somewhere quiet to review the papers. Somewhere private. A study, perhaps." The room went very still. "You're mad," Vivian breathed. But there was no scorn in it now. There was something closer to wonder. "I'm thorough," Eleanor said. "You taught me that too, Vivian. You don't do a thing halfway and hope. You build it so that every door is closed before your mark knows he's in the room." She rose. "Now, I've given you a choice and I meant it. You can be the woman who tells me where in that study the ledger is kept and walks out of this clean with no name attached to any of it. Or you can be the woman who said nothing and gambled that old Mr. Beaumont would protect her when it all came apart." She came around the table. "You know him better than I do, Vivian. When the law comes asking who arranged the public ruin of an innocent woman, is he the kind of man who falls on his sword to shield the girl who did his dirty work? Or is he the kind who points one finger at her and says, 'It was all her idea, her jealousy, her scheme to catch his son,' and lets her hang for it alone?" Vivian Carter said nothing for a long moment. And in that silence, Eleanor watched a thing she would remember the rest of her life. Watched a clever, beautiful, friendless woman do the arithmetic of her own survival and arrive with the cold precision of someone who had been doing it her whole life at the only answer that kept her breathing. "The bottom drawer of his writing desk," Vivian said quietly. "It locks, but the lock is old and the key's the same as the one for the wine cabinet in the dining room because he's too cheap to have a second one cut. The ledger's bound in green leather. There are two. The real accounts are in the green one. The green one has the marriage written in it in his own hand. I saw it the night they brought me into the plan. He wrote my name in it too." Carter performance position pledged. Her jaw tightened. "He wrote me down like a line of seed corn, same as he wrote you. I've hated him for it every day since." "Then we want the same thing," Eleanor said. "We do not want the same thing." Vivian stood, drawing herself up, and the old sharpness came back into her, but there was a new thread under it, something almost like grief. "You want justice, Eleanor. You can afford to want it. I want to not starve. Those are not the same thing, and they never will be. But—" She looked at the ledger drawer of her own mind, at the green leather, at her name, written down like a commodity. "For once, they point the same direction. So I'll tell you where the book is. And I'll tell you something else for nothing, because I owe him nothing. And you, oddly enough, are the only person who's spoken to me like a human being in a month." She paused at the door. "He keeps a man, a clerk named Cecil Silas Doyle. Doyle's the one who actually keeps the books, who wrote the figures. Mr. Ashford was shown. If you take the green ledger and Beaumont denies it's his hand, Doyle can swear it is. But Doyle's loyal and Doyle's frightened, and Doyle has a sick wife and 3 children and takes Beaumont's wages to feed them." She looked at Eleanor steadily. "You won't move Doyle with the truth. The truth doesn't feed children. If you want Doyle, you'll have to offer him something the truth can't. Think on that before you congratulate yourself on being thorough." And then Vivian Carter was gone out the door and into her borrowed carriage, and Eleanor stood in the parlor with the shape of the whole campaign laid out before her at last, and one new problem dropped into the middle of it like a stone into still water. A frightened clerk with a sick wife. A loyalty bought with bread. "She's right," Nathaniel said low, watching the carriage go. "Doyle's the keystone of the whole thing. A ledger's just paper unless someone'll swear to whose hand wrote it. And a man with hungry children won't risk his place for your justice, ma'am. Not unless he's got a better reason than justice." "Then we'll find him one." Eleanor turned from the window. "How much does Beaumont pay him?" $400 a year, if that. Clerk's wages." "And what would it cost?" Eleanor said slowly. "To make him an offer he couldn't get from a man like Beaumont. Not money he can get money anywhere, and Beaumont's money comes with safety, and ours comes with risk. Something Beaumont can't give him." She thought of the sick wife, the 3 children, the careful arithmetic of a man one bad season from the poorhouse. Security, a place, not wages that vanish the day his master's displeased, a thing that's his that no one can take. "You're talking about the Riverland. I'm talking about 10 acres of it." Eleanor met his eyes. "The bottomland's mine, Mr. Ashford. Mine free and clear the moment I can prove it." When this is done, I'll have more good water access land than one woman can farm, and a man like Silas Doyle, a careful man. A man who keeps honest books, even for a dishonest master, is exactly the kind of man I'll want managing it. 10 acres of his own, and an honest place, and wages that don't depend on whether his employers slept well. That's what I'll offer him. Not to lie. Only to tell the truth once in exchange for never having to fear the truth again. Nathaniel Ashford looked at her for a long moment, and something in his weathered face shifted, settled like a man setting down a load he hadn't known he'd been carrying. "I've lent money to 100 men who own land," he said. "And not one of them in 20 years has thought to ask what a clerk's loyalty is made of before they tried to buy it." He put his hat on. "You're going to win this thing, Miss Whitmore. I believe that now. I only hope you'll still recognize yourself at the end of it." "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means a person can't learn to think the way these people think," Nathaniel said, "without some of it staying in them. You sound like Vivian Carter just now. Cold, clean, reckoning a man's children as leverage." He said it gently without judgment. "I'm not saying you're wrong. The trap won't close any other way. I'm only saying be careful what you turn into to beat them. The land's worth fighting for, so's your name. But there's a thing under all of it that's worth more, and it's the thing that made me follow you out of that ballroom, and I'd hate to watch you lose it on the way to winning everything else." Eleanor was quiet. The reproof landed somewhere deep in the place where her mother's voice still lived, and she did not like how true it felt. "You think I should go to Doyle and simply ask," she said. "Trust to his conscience. Hope." "No, ma'am. Hope's not a plan, and I'm too old to pretend it is." Nathaniel turned at the door. "I think you should offer him the land same as you said, but I think when you offer it, you ought to offer it as the woman who walked out of that ballroom with her chin up, not as the woman who just spent a week learning to scheme like the people who put her there. Doyle's frightened. Frightened men don't trust cleverness. They've been burned by it. They trust a person who looks them in the eye and tells them plain what's true and what it'll cost." He tipped his hat. "Go to him plain, Miss Whitmore. It's harder than going to him clever, but it's the only thing he'll believe." He left, and Eleanor stood a long while in the empty parlor, and she did not like the thing he'd shown her about herself, and she could not unsee it. She went to Silas Doyle 3 days later, and she went plain. She found him the way Vivian had found Charles, by learning his habits and waiting where they took him. Doyle walked into town every Wednesday to fetch medicine for his wife from the apothecary, and Eleanor was sitting on the bench outside the apothecary's door when he came out, a small, gray, careful man with ink on his fingers, and worry worn into him like a groove in a step. "Mr. Doyle." He startled badly. He knew her. Of course he knew her. The whole county knew her face now, and his eyes went to the street, left and right, looking for who might be watching the ruined Whitmore girl speak to old Beaumont's clerk. "Miss Whitmore, I can't. I'm sorry for your trouble, miss, but I can't be seen. You can sit down on this bench for 2 minutes and rest your feet, Mr. Doyle. There's no law against a man resting his feet, and no shame in it. And if anyone asks, I'll say you were kind enough to give an old neighbor's daughter directions to the milliner's." She did not reach for him, did not lower her voice to a scheme's whisper. She kept it plain the way Nathaniel had said. "Sit down, please. I won't keep you long, and I won't ask you to do anything today but listen." He sat because she had given him a way to sit that wasn't dangerous, and because under the fear there was a tired man who had been on his feet since dawn. "How's your wife, Mr. Doyle?" It was not what he'd braced for. His face crumpled a little. "Poorly, miss. The damp gets in her chest. The doctor says she wants drier air, higher ground, but—" He stopped himself. A man like Doyle did not finish a sentence that ended in money he didn't have. "Higher ground," Eleanor repeated. "Away from the river damp." "It's no matter. We make do." "Mr. Doyle, I'm going to tell you something true, and then I'm going to make you an offer, and then I'm going to walk away and leave you to think on it as long as you need, with no man standing over you to hurry your answer. Will you let me do that?" He looked at her, this small, frightened, careful man, and something in the plainness of it, no threats, no cleverness, no hand on his arm, let him nod. "You keep Mr. Beaumont's books," Eleanor said. You keep them honest, I'd wager, even when what they record is not honest, because that's the kind of man you are. You write down what's true, even when the truth's a crime, because a clerk who falsifies his own ledgers has nothing left to stand on. She held his gaze. There's a green ledger in the bottom drawer of his writing desk. It records a debt my father owes. And next to that debt in Mr. Beaumont's own hand, there's a plan to break my engagement in public, to ruin me past the point of fighting back, and to take a piece of land that by law was never my father's to give. Land my grandfather left in trust to my mother and to me. She watched the recognition move through him, watched him not deny it, which was its own kind of confession. You know the ledger, I mean. Doyle said nothing. His hands had gone white around the apothecary's parcel. I'm not here to ask you to steal it, Eleanor said. I'm not here to ask you to lie. I'm here to tell you that someday soon, a lawyer is going to look at that ledger, and Mr. Beaumont is going to swear the hand that wrote it isn't his, and on that day, there will be exactly one man in Virginia who can say under oath whose hand truly wrote it. You. She let it sit. And I know what that costs a man with a sick wife and 3 children and $400 a year that vanish the day his master decides he's troublesome. I know that the truth doesn't feed children, Mr. Doyle. A woman told me that this week and she was right, and I'd be a liar to pretend otherwise. Then you understand, Doyle whispered, why I can't. I understand exactly why you can't, which is why I'm not asking you to do it for the truth. Eleanor leaned forward, and now finally she made the offer plain and whole and laid out in the open between them. The land's mine, Mr. Doyle. The moment this is settled, I'll have more good high-ground land, dry land away from the river damp than one woman can work alone. And I'll need a man to manage it. An honest man. A careful man who keeps true books even when no one's watching. I can think of exactly one. She held his eyes. 10 acres of your own, deeded to you in your name where no man can ever turn you out of it, not Beaumont, not me, not anyone. An honest place and honest wages that don't depend on your master's temper. High ground, Mr. Doyle. Dry air for your wife. She paused. All I ask in return is that when the day comes you tell the truth one time about a thing you already know to be true. That's all. Not a lie, not a theft. The truth once, in exchange for never having to be afraid of it again. Silas Doyle sat on the bench with the medicine for his dying-by-inches wife clutched in his inky hands, and he did not answer, and his eyes filled, and Eleanor saw the war in him. The loyalty Beaumont had bought with bread against the thing she was offering, which was the one thing Beaumont in 20 years had never thought to give him a future that didn't depend on a powerful man's goodwill. Why? Doyle finally managed. Why would you give a stranger 10 acres of land you fought this hard to keep? Because someone has to break the way it's always done, Eleanor said simply. All my life, Mr. Doyle, men have bought people. My father sold me to clear a debt. Beaumont bought Vivian Carter with a promise of position. He bought you with wages a man can't afford to lose. Everyone's owned by someone, and the someone always holds the bread. She stood. I'd rather give a man land than rent his fear. That's the whole of it. You don't have to believe it today. You don't have to answer today. I'll send word when the time comes, and you'll decide then, free with no one standing over you. She looked down at him gently. Go home to your wife, Mr. Doyle. Tell her there might be higher ground coming. And if you decide you can't if the fear's too much, and I'll not blame you if it is, then you tell me no, and I'll never trouble you again, and I'll find another way. But I wanted you to know there was a door. Most men in your place never even get shown the door. She walked away and did not look back, and she did not know as she walked whether she had won him or lost him. And that not knowing, that willingness to make the offer plain and leave the man free, was the first thing she had done in 2 weeks that felt like the woman who had walked out of the ballroom and not the woman who had learned to think like the people who put her there. She found out 3 days later. Old Mr. Beaumont, exactly as Eleanor had predicted, moved fast. Nathaniel's visit had done its work. The threat of the moneylender pulling out had frightened the old man badly, and within the week, a letter came to the Whitmore house addressed to Jonathan Whitmore, but truly meant for Eleanor proposing that the families settle the unfortunate matter between them amicably and privately, to spare all parties further distress, with an offer to purchase the river bottom land at a price that was on its face almost generous. Almost. It was perhaps a third of what the land was worth. Eleanor's father came to her room with the letter in his hand, and for the first time in 2 weeks, he did not order. He asked. "Beaumont's made an offer for the bottom land," Jonathan Whitmore said. He looked older than he had at the engagement grayer, as if the scheme's unraveling had aged him a year a day. "He says it clears the whole debt and leaves a little besides. He says—" He stopped. "Eleanor, I know what I did. I know there's no forgiving it. But this offer, if we take it, the debt's gone, the house is safe. You'd have a little money of your own. It's the best end any of us is likely to get. His voice cracked. "I'm asking you, not telling you. For once in my life I'm asking. Will you sign it?" And Eleanor looked at her father, this proud, broken gray man, who had sold her and stolen from her, and now stood in her doorway asking finally, instead of commanding, and she felt the old love and the new grief and the cold, clear knowledge all at once. "No, father," she said. "I won't sign it. But I'll tell you what I will do." She rose. "I'll meet him. I'll let him think I'm going to sign it. I'll let him believe he's won one more time because a man like Beaumont can't help himself. He'll want to gloat. He'll want me across his own table in his own house, signing away my mother's land while he watches. And while he's watching me, father, I am going to take back everything he stole and everything you let him take, and I am going to do it in a way that not one court in Virginia will be able to undo." She looked at him steadily. "And you're going to help me. Because the one thing that might buy back a sliver of what you owe me is to stand in that room when the truth comes out and say in front of witnesses that you knew the land was mine when you pledged it, that you wronged me, that every word I say is true." Jonathan Whitmore went very still. "That's a confession to a crime, Eleanor. I could be ruined. I could be charged." "Yes," Eleanor said. "You could. Welcome to it, father. It's where you put me 2 weeks ago, and I've found I'm still standing, and I expect you will be too." She softened just slightly, because he was still her father, and the love did not die just because the trust had. "Or you can refuse and stay safe, and we'll both know exactly what your apology was worth. The choice is yours. For once, the choice is entirely yours. It's a strange thing, isn't it, being handed the worst version of your own situation and asked to choose? I had it handed to me in a ballroom. Now I'm handing it to you." She turned back to her window. "Think on it. You have until the meeting." The meeting was set for the following Friday at the Beaumont house at noon. Eleanor spent the days before it the way a general spends the days before a battle, not in worry but in arrangement. She engaged a lawyer in Richmond, a sharp young man named Holloway, who owed his start to old Mr. Pruitt, and who lit up like a struck match when Eleanor laid the trust and Charles's signed confession before him. She and Nathaniel went over the plan a dozen times, each angle, each door. And on Wednesday, the day Silas Doyle walked to town for his wife's medicine, Eleanor sat again on the bench outside the apothecary and waited, and did not know what she would hear. Doyle came out. He saw her, and this time he did not look up and down the street for who might be watching. He sat down beside her, and for a moment he said nothing, and then he reached into his coat and drew out a folded paper and pressed it into her hands. "I can't take the green ledger, miss," he said quietly. "He'd know by sundown, and he'd burn everything else before you could blink, and then there'd be nothing. But I can do this." He nodded at the paper. "It's a copy. In my own hand, made over 3 nights when he was at his cups. Every entry off the green ledger that touches your debt and your land, and Miss Carter's what he called her arrangement. Every word copied true with the dates. And I've written at the bottom and signed it that it's a faithful copy of Mr. Beaumont's own book kept in the bottom drawer of his writing desk, and that I am the man who can swear to his hand because I have kept his accounts 11 years. His own hands were shaking. It won't stop him saying the copy's a forgery. But the day a lawyer puts the green ledger and my copy side by side, and they match line for line, dates and all, No court in the world will believe a clerk could forge his master's private book that he'd never seen. He looked at her gray and frightened, and somehow underneath it steadier than she had ever seen him. You said you'd rather give a man land than rent his fear. I've been rented my whole life, miss. I decided I'd like to find out what the other thing feels like. Boreas. Eleanor's throat closed. She had gone to him plain the way Nathaniel said, expecting at best a frightened maybe. And he had spent 3 secret nights by candlelight building her the keystone of the whole thing, not because she'd been clever, but because she'd offered him a door and left him free to walk through it. Mr. Doyle, she said, and her voice was not entirely steady. The land is yours. 10 acres high ground, dry air. The moment this is done, whatever else comes of it, win or lose. That's a promise, and you'll have it in writing within the week witnessed, so that it doesn't depend on my goodwill any more than it depends on Beaumont's. Whatever happens Friday, you and your wife have higher ground. You've earned it 10 times over. It ain't earned yet, miss. Not till Friday's done. It's earned, Eleanor said firmly. A man's word that costs him everything to give is earned the moment he gives it. The rest is just paperwork. Doyle almost smiled. He had not, she thought, smiled in a very long time. Friday came. They met in old Mr. Beaumont's dining room, because the room with the green ledger was kept locked, and Beaumont was not fool enough to conduct business in the room that held his secrets. Eleanor came with her father, silent and gray, beside her, and with the lawyer Holloway carrying a leather case of papers, and Nathaniel Ashford came separately on the pretext of his own loan, so that no one would think the moneylender and the ruined girl had any cause to be allied. Old Mr. Beaumont received them like a man who had already won. He was expansive, generous, full of regret for the unfortunate business, with his son full of assurances that the offer he made was the kindest end for everyone. He had the deed of sale drawn up and waiting. He had pen and ink set out. He sat at the head of his own table in his own house, and he looked at Eleanor Whitmore, the way a man looks at a thing he is about to fold up and put in his pocket. I'm glad you've seen sense, Miss Whitmore, he said. There's no profit in dragging out a sad affair. We sign the debts forgiven, your family keeps the house, and we all put this summer behind us, shall we? In a moment, Mr. Beaumont. Eleanor sat very straight, her hands folded, calm as still water. My lawyer would like to review the deed first. It's only proper. He'll need somewhere quiet to read it without our chatter distracting him. Your study, perhaps? A flicker, the smallest flicker, crossed old Beaumont's face. The study's not in order. Use the morning room. The morning room's fine, Holloway said smoothly, gathering his case. Wherever's convenient. And he rose, and a servant moved to show him out, and that was the moment, the hinge of the whole thing. Because Holloway going to the morning room meant the study stayed locked, and the green ledger stayed safe, and the entire plan turned on, getting that drawer open with the one key that also opened the wine cabinet in the very room where they all sat. Eleanor looked at her father. It was the moment. Everything depended on whether Jonathan Whitmore had chosen, in the long quiet days since she'd handed him his own worst situation, to be the man who'd sold her or something better. Her father stood up. Beaumont, Jonathan Whitmore said, and his voice shook, and then it didn't. Before any deed is signed in this house, there's a thing I have to say. A thing I should have said 2 weeks ago in a ballroom when my daughter walked out of it alone, and not one soul, including her own father, had the courage to follow her. The room went silent. What in God's name are you? Beaumont began. I knew the bottomland wasn't mine to pledge. Jonathan Whitmore said it loud and clear, and to the whole room the way a man confesses at the foot of something larger than himself. My father left it in trust to my late wife, and through her to my daughter. I knew it when I signed it over to you as surety. I knew it, and I did it anyway, because I was a coward, and I was in debt, and you made it easy, Beaumont. You made it so easy to sell my own child. He turned to Eleanor, and there were tears on the proud gray face. I wronged you past forgiving, and I'll not buy my way out of it by helping this man steal from you twice. The land is yours. It was always yours. And I'll swear to it before any court in Virginia. And in the stunned silence that followed, old Beaumont half risen from his chair, the lawyer frozen in the doorway. Nathaniel Ashford very slowly and very deliberately setting down his glass. Eleanor Whitmore reached across the table, took the small brass key from beside the wine decanter, where old Beaumont, too cheap to have a second cut, had left it sitting in plain sight all along, and closed her hand around it. "Mr. Holloway," she said, rising, her voice ringing clear and steady through the room where she had been meant to sign herself away. "I believe the documents you'll want to review aren't in the morning room after all. They're in the bottom drawer of Mr. Beaumont's writing desk, bound in green leather." She looked at old Beaumont, and she did not gloat, because she had learned at last that the truth needs no gloating to land. "Shall we all go and have a look together?" Old Mr. Beaumont came out of his chair all the way then, and the genial host was gone, sloughed off in an instant, like a coat dropped on the floor. "You'll not go near my study," he said. "This is my house. You've no right, no warrant, nothing. That drawer holds my private papers, and I'll see any man hang who touches the lock." "Then you've nothing to fear from us looking, have you?" Eleanor held up the brass key, turning it once in the light, so the whole room could see where she'd taken it from. A man with honest books leaves the wine key by the decanter and laughs when his guests admire his vintage. A man with something to hide goes pale when a girl picks it up. "You've gone very pale, Mr. Beaumont. Put that down, Mr. Holloway." Eleanor did not look away from the old man. "You're an officer of the court. You heard my father swear just now before all of us that the bottom land was held in trust and pledged unlawfully. You're holding the trust documents in that case. In your professional judgment, does a man have the right to inspect the records of a transaction he's a party to when fraud's been sworn to in the room?" Holloway, young and sharp and lit up like a lamp, set his leather case on the table. "He does, Miss Whitmore. More than a right. With a sworn statement of fraud from a principal party." He nodded at Jonathan Whitmore. "Any document bearing on that fraud becomes evidence the moment it's named. Mr. Beaumont can refuse us the drawer. But he should understand that refusing after fraud's been sworn is a thing a court will hear about and weigh and remember." He looked at the old man almost pleasantly. "Innocent men open drawers, sir. It's the guilty ones who'd rather hang first." "Get out of my house!" Beaumont's voice had climbed. "All of you. Whitmore, you sniveling fool, do you know what you've done? You've confessed to a crime. You'll lose everything." "I've already lost everything that mattered," Jonathan Whitmore said quietly. "I lost it the night I watched my girl walk out of a ballroom alone. The house, the land, take it. I find it weighs nothing against the look on her face when she learned what I'd done." He had stopped shaking entirely now. There was a strange peace on the gray face, the peace of a man who has finally put down a thing too heavy to carry. "Open the drawer, Eleanor." But it was Nathaniel Ashford who moved. He rose from his place at the side of the table, unhurried, and he crossed to stand between old Beaumont and the dining room door, and he did it so naturally that it was a moment before anyone understood he had just cut off the old man's only path to the study ahead of them. "You'll want to sit back down, Beaumont," Nathaniel said. His voice was mild. It was the mildness that made it terrible. "Because here's the part you haven't reckoned yet, and you ought to reckon it before you say another word about hanging and warrants. I hold your paper. 18 months of it. 3 weeks ago your man Doyle sat in my house and showed me a ledger and swore on your behalf that $11,000 of good money was as good as collected money you'd already borrowed against from me. You used my loan, Beaumont. You financed the ruin of this girl with my money, and you lied to my face to do it." He took one step closer. "Now, a man in my position has got two choices. He can call the law down on the whole rotten business, fraud, false accounting, a debt secured against land the borrower didn't own, and let it drag through the courts for 2 years, while everyone's name gets dirty, mine included. Or he can settle it quiet here today in this room, with the green ledger open on the table, where we can all see what's true." He let that sit. "I'd sooner settle it quiet. I'm a businessman, not a vengeful one, but I'll only settle quiet if I see the book. So you can hand me that drawer, Beaumont, and we'll talk like men about how this ends, or you can keep refusing, and I'll walk out that door and straight to the magistrate, and then it won't be quiet ever again. Your choice. You've got about as long as it takes me to lose my patience." Old Mr. Beaumont stood in the middle of his own dining room, hemmed by a lawyer who'd named his crime a moneylender, who held his debt, a girl who held his key, and a partner in cowardice who'd just confessed the whole thing to the heir. And Eleanor watched the calculation move behind his eyes, watched him reach the way she'd watched Vivian reach for the part that kept him standing. "This is extortion," he said, but the fire had gone out of it. "No, sir," Eleanor said. "Extortion is making a woman marry to clear a debt. Extortion is paying another woman in position to humiliate her in public. Extortion is taking land that isn't yours and daring the law to stop you. What we're doing is the opposite of all that. We're opening a book." She set the brass key down on the table in front of him gently with a small click. "Open it yourself, Mr. Beaumont. Let no one say we forced the drawer. Open it yourself, and let the book say what the book says, and we'll all of us live with what's written there. That's all justice ever is in the end. Just letting the true thing be seen." For a long moment, no one moved. Then, old Mr. Beaumont, his hand trembling now in a way Eleanor's never had picked up the key. They went to the study together, all of them, and it was old Beaumont himself who unlocked the bottom drawer of his writing desk with the wine key, because Eleanor had given him no way to refuse that wouldn't look like guilt, and he drew out the green leather ledger and set it on the desk, and his hands had gone the color of paper. Holloway opened it. He found the page, and he read in his clear young courtroom voice what old Mr. Beaumont had written in his own hand. "The Whitmore debt, 4 years of it, the parcels pledged as surety with the bottom land marked among them, and beside the bottom land in the same hand the single damning word, marriage, and beneath the entries, a line that made even Nathaniel Ashford go still, Carter performance position pledged in lieu of fee." He had written it all down, every piece of it. The price of a woman's ruin and the wages of the woman paid to perform it, set in a column like the cost of seed and nails, because old Mr. Beaumont had been so certain, so entirely certain, that no one would ever open the drawer. "That's not—" Beaumont started. "A man writes many things in private accounts that don't mean those are only notes. Speculations a businessman considers all manner of—" "It's your hand," Holloway said. "You can't prove it's my hand." And here Eleanor reached into the case Holloway carried and drew out Silas Doyle's copy, the faithful copy made over 3 secret nights by candlelight, and laid it open on the desk beside the green ledger, and the 2 pages sat side by side, entry for entry, date for date, word for word, the same. "This is a copy of that book," Eleanor said, "made by the man who's kept your accounts 11 years. He'll swear it's your hand, Mr. Beaumont, because he's seen you write in this very book 1,000 times. And the day a court lays his copy beside your original and finds them matched line for line dates and all, no jury in Virginia will believe a clerk forged the private ledger of a book he was never supposed to touch." She looked at him steadily. "You wrote it down. You were so sure of yourself you wrote it all down. And the only thing more dangerous than an enemy, Mr. Beaumont, is a written record kept by an honest man." Old Beaumont sank into the chair behind his desk. The bluster was gone. What was left was an old man looking at his own handwriting and understanding finally that it had hanged him. "Doyle," he whispered. "Doyle did this." "Doyle told the truth," Eleanor said. "Once, in exchange for never having to be afraid of it again. You had 11 years to give that man one thing he couldn't get anywhere else, and you never did. You only ever paid him wages and let him fear losing them. I gave him 10 acres of his own and an honest place. That's the difference between us, Mr. Beaumont. You rented people. I'd rather they be free." She paused. "It turns out free men make poor accomplices and excellent witnesses." What happened over the following hour was not a triumph, and Eleanor was glad of it, because she had learned by now that the triumphs she'd imagined in her worst moments, Beaumont ruined, dragged away, made to suffer as she'd suffered, were not what she wanted at all. What she wanted was the truth set down where it couldn't be moved, and her mother's land back in her own hand, and an end to the thing that didn't owe anyone a single new wound. So when Holloway began to speak of charges of fraud and false pledge and the magistrate, it was Eleanor who stopped him. "No," she said. The room turned to her. "Miss Whitmore." Holloway said carefully. "The man has confessed in writing to defrauding you of an inheritance. The charges would stand. He'd be ruined, likely jailed. It's no more than the law allows, and no more than he earned. I know what he earned." Eleanor walked to the window of the study, not to look out for. She did not care what was out there, but to put her back to the table a moment and gather the things she meant to say. Then she turned around. "I've thought a great deal these 2 weeks about what I wanted from this. I'll tell you all the truth in the beginning. What I wanted was for him to hurt. For all of them to hurt the way I hurt standing alone in that ballroom. I wanted Charles disgraced and Vivian thrown in the gutter, and this man dragged out of his fine house in chains in front of the whole county that watched me fall." She looked at old Beaumont, small and gray behind his desk. "But I've watched what wanting people to hurt does to a person. I watched it in Vivian Carter, who's so good at it, she's forgotten how to want anything else. I watched it nearly get into me. And I find I don't want it. I don't want to become a person who collects the suffering of others like it's owed me. So no. No charges, no jail, no dragging anyone anywhere." "Then what?" Beaumont said, and there was naked confusion in it. He had braced for ruin. He did not understand mercy, and it frightened him more than the law had. "What do you want?" "I want what's mine." Eleanor came back to the desk. "The bottomland returned to me free and clear, with a deed signed today before these witnesses, acknowledging it was always held in trust and never lawfully yours to take. I want the $11,000 debt against my father struck entirely because it was secured against land that was never his, which makes the security void. Which Mr. Holloway will explain, unwinds the whole instrument. And I expect you knew that too, didn't you? When you made the loan, because a debt you could call in any time, suited you far better than one that was ever meant to be repaid." She watched him not deny it. "And I want one thing more, and this is the only thing in all of it that I want for spite, so I'll own it plainly. I want a letter, written by you in your own hand in this green ledger you were so fond of writing in, and copied out fair and signed, stating that the engagement between myself and your son was arranged to fail, that I was never jilted for any cause of my own, and that every word spoken against my character this summer was false. I want it witnessed, and I want the freedom to show it to whomever I please, whenever I please, for as long as I live." The study was silent. "You're not asking for money," Beaumont said slowly. "I never was. You're the one who thought everything could be bought and sold, Mr. Beaumont. Me, Vivian, Doyle, my father's honor. You measured the whole world in dollars, and you never once understood that the thing you took from me in that ballroom couldn't be bought back with any sum on earth." She leaned both hands on the desk. "But it can be returned. A man can give back a name. Not with money, with the truth written plain in the same hand that tried to destroy it. That's what I want from you, not your suffering, your signature under the truth. And then we're done, and you'll never see me again. And you can keep your house, and your cotton, and what's left of your good name, and spend the rest of your days knowing exactly what it's worth, which is exactly as much as the woman you tried to throw away decides to let it be worth every single day for the rest of your life." It was, Eleanor understood even as she said it, the cruelest thing she could have done to a man like old Mr. Beaumont, crueler than jail, crueler than ruin. To let him keep everything and owe it all to her mercy. To make him live every remaining day inside the knowledge that the quiet little Whitmore girl he'd reckoned as collateral had held his whole life in her hand and chosen out of something he could not even name to give it back to him. He understood it too. She saw him understand it. And she watched him pick up his pen. The deed was signed within the hour. The debt was struck. The instrument unwound with Holloway's careful pen. The bottomland returned to Eleanor Whitmore, free and clear. And old Mr. Beaumont wrote out in the green ledger, and then fair upon good paper, witnessed by his own lawyer and Eleanor's and Nathaniel Ashford, besides the full and true account of how an innocent woman had been arranged into ruin for the price of a parcel of riverland, and signed it, his hand steady at the last, because there was nothing left to shake about. Eleanor folded the letter and put it inside her glove, where her mother's trust had ridden 2 weeks before. "There's one more matter. Holloway said, gathering the green ledger to take into safekeeping. Miss Carter, the ledger names her. The letter names her. If you wish to pursue her, I don't. Eleanor was already drawing on her glove over the folded confession. Vivian Carter played her part for position because the world handed her a fine face and no fortune and told her those were the only two cards she'd ever be dealt. She did a wicked thing, but she did it from a smaller, meaner kind of desperation than this man's. She nodded at Beaumont. And she's the only one in all of it who'll go on paying for it every day without anyone having to lift a finger. She's tied her whole future to the Beaumonts, and the Beaumonts are finished as anyone of consequence the moment this summer's talked through. She gambled everything on becoming Mrs. Charles Beaumont, and Charles is in Philadelphia, and won't be coming back to a family with no money and no name. She'll get nothing. She bet her life on these people, and these people just lost. Eleanor's voice was not unkind. That's punishment enough, and it's a punishment I didn't have to choose. The world's handing it to her all on its own. I'll not add to it. She did, though, do one thing for Vivian Carter, and she did it that same week, and she told no one but Hattie. She sent the woman a letter. 3 lines unsigned, the way she'd written to the Richmond clerk a lifetime ago. You told me the truth is the cheapest thing in the world. You were wrong. It's the most expensive thing there is, and you and I are the only 2 people in this whole affair who paid full price for it. I hope you find a place where you don't have to perform. There aren't many, but they exist. She never knew if Vivian read it. She only knew that a month later, Vivian Carter left the county for good alone bound west by the post road, and that was the last anyone in Virginia ever heard of her. The thing Eleanor had not planned for, the thing that no scheme of hers had accounted for, was what came after winning. She had spent 2 weeks with every nerve bent toward a single point, the meeting the ledger, the truth set down where it couldn't be moved. And then it was done, all of it in a single afternoon. And she went home to the Whitmore house that was safe, now hers and her father's. Both the debt gone, the land restored. Her name returned to her in old Beaumont's own hand, and she sat down at her mother's writing desk in the gray evening light. And the strength that had held her up for 14 days simply went out of her all at once, like a tide going out. And she put her face in her hands and wept. She wept the way she had not let herself weep in the ballroom or the carriage or any night since. She wept for the father she'd loved and could not trust again. For the girl she'd been 2 weeks ago, who'd believed she was getting married, who'd believed her father had her happiness somewhere in his heart. For the cost of all the cleverness she'd had to learn. For Doyle's sick wife and Vivian's bitter face and Charles weeping on a river road, and her own mother dead these 6 years, who'd had the foresight to leave her daughter land in trust, because some part of her must have known even then that the men in Eleanor's life could not be relied upon to protect her. Hattie found her like that and did not say a word, only sat down on the floor beside the chair and leaned her head against Eleanor's knee the way a sister would, and stayed there until it was full dark. I won, Hattie, Eleanor finally said, her voice wrecked. I won everything. Why does it feel like grief? Because winning ain't the same as healing, miss, Hattie said simply. You got your land back. You got your name back. But you can't get back the 2 weeks ago when you still thought your daddy loved you more than money. That's gone. Winning don't bring it back. Nothing brings that back. You just have to find a way to live in the after. Eleanor looked down at the girl who'd carried her letters and stood in doorways and learned to lift her chin from watching her mistress survive. When did you get so wise? Same time you did, miss. Hattie almost smiled. These last 2 weeks, we both grew up some, didn't we? It was Nathaniel Ashford who came the next morning, and Eleanor was almost glad to be too hollowed out to put up any of her usual composure, because it meant she met him as she actually was, rather than as she wished to appear. He found her on the porch, with her eyes still swollen, and her hair not perfectly dressed, and he did not pretend not to notice, and he did not pity her, and he sat down on the step below her, without being asked the way a man sits who means to stay a while. You won, he said, so everyone keeps telling me. And it feels like the bottom dropped out of the world. She looked at him. How did you know that? Because I've won a few hard things in my life, ma'am, and not one of them felt like the song says it ought to." He turned his hat in his hands, that old habit. There's a thing nobody tells you about fighting for your life. While you're doing it, the fight holds you up. Every nerve, every hour bent on the one thing. And then you win, and the fight lets go of you all at once, and you find out it was the only thing keeping you standing. He looked out at the fields. "You're going to feel hollow for a while, Miss Whitmore. That's not weakness. That's the price of having held yourself together for 2 weeks straight without once letting yourself fall. The falling's got to happen somewhere. Better it happens now on your own porch than that it never happened at all." Eleanor was quiet a long moment. "You came all this way to tell me it's all right to feel terrible after winning." "I came," Nathaniel said, "to tell you that what you did in that study, choosing not to ruin a man you had every right to ruin, was the bravest thing I saw in this whole business. Braver than walking out of the ballroom. Anybody can be brave when they're losing. There's nothing else to do but stand up. It's a rarer thing to be merciful when you're winning, when ruining the man would feel so good, and be so easy, and so deserved." He met her eyes. "I told you back at the start that I was afraid you'd lose the thing that made me follow you out of that room. The thing under all of it. You didn't lose it. I watched you reach the very edge of becoming Vivian Carter, and I watched you choose not to. That's why I'm here this morning. Not because you won. Because of how you won." And Eleanor Whitmore hollowed out and wept dry and more honest in that moment than she had let herself be with anyone looked at this grave, plain, weathered man who had stood in the back of a ballroom and seen something in her that her own father never had, and felt the first small warmth come into the hollow place since the tide went out. "You keep saying you followed me out of that ballroom," she said. "You never told me why you were there. At the engagement of 2 families you had no part in. A moneylender doesn't get invited to celebrate a marriage." Nathaniel was quiet a moment. "I invited myself," he admitted. "I'd seen the figures 3 weeks before, remember? The 11,000, the word marriage, the whole rotten shape of it. I knew something was going to happen at that party. I didn't know what. I came to watch because I wanted to know what kind of thing was being done with my money, and I wanted to see the faces of the people doing it." He turned the hat. "I'll be honest with you, ma'am, since we seem to be telling truths this morning. I came expecting to feel disgusted and go home and decide whether to wash my hands of the Beaumonts. I did not come expecting to watch a woman take the worst public moment of her life and turn it into the most dignified thing in the room. I did not come expecting." He stopped, and for the first time since she'd known him, Nathaniel Ashford looked something other than certain. "I did not come expecting you. And I've spent 2 weeks telling myself I was helping you out of principle because Beaumont lied to me, because I won't be made party to a fraud. And that's true. But it ain't the whole truth, and you taught me yourself there's no use in a man giving half the truth and calling it the full one." Eleanor's breath had gone careful. "Mr. Ashford, I'm not asking you for anything," he said quickly, and he meant it. She could see he meant it. "Lord knows the last thing you need 2 weeks out from being sold like a parcel of land is another man telling you what he wants from you. You've had a belly full of men wanting things from you. I'd cut off my own hand before I'd be one more." He stood and put his hat on and looked down at her with that steadiness that had never once held pity. "I'm only telling you the truth, because I think you've earned the truth from at least one man this summer, that's all. I think you're the finest thing I've seen in 20 years of doing business with people at their worst. And I think when you're ready, not now, not soon, maybe not for a year, maybe never, and I'll be all right, whichever way it falls, but when you're ready, if you ever are to think about a partnership between 2 people who own good land side by side on the same river." The corner of his mouth moved. "A partnership mind, not a rescue with every decision in it. Belonging to you the same as me. Then you'll know where to find me. And until then, I'll be your neighbor and your friend, and the man who'll come stand on your porch when winning feels like grief. That's a standing offer. It doesn't expire, and it doesn't come due, and you never have to answer it at all." He tipped his hat to her, the old soldier's gesture done without thinking. "Ma'am," he said, and Eleanor Whitmore, who 2 weeks before had returned a man's ring on a silver tray and walked out of a ballroom. Certain she would never again let anyone hold her future in their hands. Watched Nathaniel Ashford walk to his horse and found to her own great surprise, in the hollow, wept dry honesty of that gray morning, that for the first time in a long time, the thought of a man's offer did not feel like a cage. It felt like a door, left open, with no one standing over her to make her walk through it. She did not call after him. She wasn't ready, and he knew she wasn't, and the not rushing of it was its own kind of gift. But she sat on the porch a long while after he'd gone with her mother's land safe around her, and her name folded in old Beaumont's own hand inside her glove, and she let herself feel the warmth come back into the hollow place slow like a tide turning, and she understood that the worst summer of her life had given her at its very end the one thing all the schemes and ledgers and confessions never could. It had given her back to herself, whole and free and beholden to no one. A woman who would never again wait in a ballroom to be chosen because she had learned the hardest way there is, that the only choosing that had ever mattered was her own. The hollow place did not fill all at once. It filled the way a field comes back after a hard frost, slow and from the roots, and in ways Eleanor did not always notice, until she looked up one day and found that something she'd thought was dead had put out green. The first green came from an unlikely quarter. It came from her father. Jonathan Whitmore had confessed his crime in a room full of witnesses and had braced himself in the days after for the ruin he believed he'd earned. He moved through the house like a man waiting for a sentence quiet gray, asking nothing of his daughter taking his meals alone, when she did not seek him out, which in those first raw days she did not. The thing between them was broken, and Eleanor had not pretended otherwise, and she would not insult them both by pretending now. But a week after the meeting at the Beaumont house, she came down before dawn and found her father already in the study. Not his study for. He kept to the small one, now having quietly ceded the great one to her as though the house itself had reorganized around the truth, and he was bent over a stack of papers with a candle guttering beside him, and he had been there. She understood from the look of him most of the night. "Father, it's not yet light." He looked up. There were ink stains on his fingers, and his eyes were rimmed red, and he looked older than she had ever seen him, and somehow, underneath it, younger too, lighter, like a man who has set down a weight he carried so long he'd forgotten it could be set down. "I've been going through the accounts," he said, "all of them, not just the Beaumont business, everything. Every debt, every pledge, every paper I signed these 4 years while I was drowning and too proud to say so." He pushed the stack toward her. "I want you to see it, all of it. I never showed your mother the books you know. I never showed anyone. I thought a man kept his troubles to himself, that letting his family see him struggle was a kind of failure, worse than the struggle itself." His voice cracked. "And that pride is what sold you, Eleanor. Not the debt. The debt I could have survived if I'd had the courage to say out loud to my own daughter, 'I am in trouble and I do not know the way out.' I'd rather have lost the house 10 times over than do what I did because I couldn't bear to be seen needing help." Eleanor stood in the doorway and looked at the offered books at her father, offering her for the first time in her life the truth of his own weakness laid bare. "Why are you showing me now?" "Because you're the one who owns the land," he said simply, "and because I'll not make the same mistake twice. You should know exactly what this family stands on down to the last dollar, so that no man, not me, not any husband, not anyone, can ever again decide your future in a room you weren't allowed into." He met her eyes. "I can't undo it, Eleanor. I know that. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I don't think you can, and I don't think you should. But I can do this. I can stop being a man who keeps his books in the dark. It's the only apology I've got that's worth anything." And Eleanor, who had braced herself against every soft feeling toward her father for 2 weeks, felt something shift. Not forgiveness, not yet, perhaps not for a long while, but the first crack in the wall through which forgiveness might someday come. She crossed the room. She sat down beside him. She pulled the candle closer and drew the first ledger toward her. "Then show me," she said, "all of it. And Father, from now on, when this family's in trouble, you tell me. Not because you owe me, because I'm the one who'll find the way out. I've gotten rather good at it." Jonathan Whitmore laughed a wet, broken, astonished laugh, the first true laugh she'd heard from him since before the engagement, and they sat together in the candlelight going through 4 years of debt as the dawn came up over the tobacco fields, father and daughter, and it was not healing, not yet, but it was the ground that healing would someday grow from. The second green came from the land itself. Eleanor took possession of the river bottom land that autumn free and clear. Her mother's trust made whole at last, and she did with it the thing she had promised Silas Doyle on a bench outside an apothecary. She deeded him 10 acres of the high ground dry and away from the damp in his own name, witnessed and recorded so that no man living could ever turn him out of it. She did it before she did anything else with the land, before she'd even decided what to do with the rest, because a promise made to a frightened man was the first debt she meant to honor now that she had the means. Doyle moved his sick wife to the high ground before the first frost. The dry air did what the doctor had said it would. By Christmas, his wife was sitting up, and by spring she was walking the 10 acres on her husband's arm. And Doyle, steady, careful, honest Silas Doyle, who had spent 11 years keeping true books for a dishonest master, took over the management of Eleanor's land with a devotion that no wage could ever have bought, because she had not bought it. She had freed it. "You changed my life, miss," he told her once the spring after standing at the edge of a field he now helped her plant. "I want you to know I know it. A man don't forget who gave him solid ground to stand on." "You changed mine first, Mr. Doyle," Eleanor said. "You spent 3 nights by candlelight copying a book that could have cost you everything for a woman who couldn't promise you it would even work. Don't you ever let anyone tell you the small, careful men don't matter. The whole thing turned on you. The lawyers and the lenders and the clever schemes, none of it would have held without one honest man willing to write down what was true." She looked out over the green coming up in the rows. "We saved each other. That's the only kind of saving worth anything. The kind that runs both directions." The third green, and this one took longest and frightened her most, and meant the most when it finally came, grew up slowly between herself and Nathaniel Ashford. He kept his word exactly. He did not press. He did not call with the eager regularity of a suitor pretending to be a friend. He was simply her neighbor, and then her friend, and the friendship was real and unhurried, and built on the only foundation Eleanor trusted anymore, which was that he wanted nothing from her she was not free to withhold. He came when the river flooded the low fields that first wet spring, and worked beside her men for 2 days, hauling stock to high ground, and asked for nothing, and went home muddy, and said only, "Glad it held, ma'am," and tipped his hat. He came when she could not make sense of a contract a Charleston cotton buyer had sent full of clauses designed to cheat a woman. The buyer assumed knew nothing, and he sat at her table and went through it line by line, not deciding for her, only explaining, so that by the end she understood it better than the man who'd written it, and sent back a revision that made the buyer blanch. He came most of all when she simply needed someone to sit with who did not want her to be anything other than what she was. They would sit on her porch in the long summer evenings, the second summer now, a full year past the ballroom, and they would talk about land and weather and the price of leaf, about the books her father now kept openly about Doyle's wife, walking the high ground about everything and nothing, and sometimes they would not talk at all, and the silence between them was the most comfortable thing Eleanor had known in years. It was on one of those evenings a year and a little more past the night she'd returned a ring on a silver tray that she finally spoke the thing she'd been turning over for months. "You told me once," Eleanor said, "that your offer didn't expire and didn't come due, and that I never had to answer it at all." Nathaniel went very still beside her. He did not turn the hat in his hands. He had set it aside long ago in her company, but she saw his hands go quiet on his knees, in the way she'd learned meant he was holding something carefully. "I did say that," he said, "and I meant it. I still mean it. You don't owe me an answer, Eleanor. Not tonight, not ever." "I know I don't." She turned to look at him fully. "That's exactly why I'm going to give you one." He waited. He had always known how to wait. "For a year, I've been asking myself a question," Eleanor said. "And the question was never whether I cared for you. I knew that answer a long time ago, longer than I wanted to admit. The question was whether I could care for a man and still belong to myself. Because every model I ever had said you couldn't. My father owned my mother's silence. The Beaumonts owned Vivian's performance and Doyle's fear. Charles was owned by his father's plans. Everywhere I looked, love and marriage and partnership were just prettier words for who held the bread and who went hungry. Her voice was steady and clear and carried all the weight of a year's hard thinking. I watched my whole world, and I never once saw two people stand side by side as equals. I didn't believe it existed. I thought it was a thing they told girls so they'd go quietly into the cage. And now, Nathaniel asked quietly, and now I've spent a year watching a man prove it does. Eleanor's eyes were bright, but she did not weep. She was past weeping for any reason that mattered to this. You came when I needed you and left when I didn't. You explained the contract and let me decide. You hauled my stock to high ground and asked for nothing. You made an offer once, and then you let it sit for a year without ever once picking it up to remind me it was there. Do you know what that taught me, Nathaniel? It taught me that a man can want a woman his whole heart and still leave her free. That the two things aren't opposites. That I was wrong. We were all wrong, every woman who ever went quiet into the cage, because the cage was never the only choice. There was always another kind of door. I just never saw a man hold one open before. Not until you. Nathaniel Ashford looked at her, and the certainty that had never left his face the whole time she'd known him wavered at last, not from doubt, but from the sheer weight of feeling, and when he spoke his voice was rough. Eleanor, are you saying— I'm saying yes, she said. But I'm saying it my way, and you're going to hear all of it before you answer, because I'll not walk into one more arrangement I don't fully understand. She squared her shoulders. I keep my land, in my own name, deeded to me, never merged with yours. Not because I don't trust you, but because a woman should never again be in a position where a man's goodwill is the only thing standing between her and ruin. My daughters, if we have them, inherit in their own right the way my mother had the wisdom to leave it to me. I keep my own books, and you keep yours, and we decide the joint ones together as partners, with neither one able to sign away the other's future in a room the other isn't in. And if I ever find myself going quiet, swallowing what I think to keep a peace, shrinking to fit a space. You've left me. You have to promise me you'll call it out, because I've spent my whole life learning to make myself small, and I'd rather die than teach it to a daughter. She drew a breath. Those are my terms, Nathaniel Ashford. That's the partnership. Not a rescue. Not a merger. Two people who own good land side by side on the same river, who choose each other every single day freely and could walk away and don't. Will you have me on those terms, because I'll not have you on any others? For a long moment, Nathaniel said nothing at all. Then he reached over slowly, the way he did everything, and he took her hand, the left one, the one that had been bare since the night she'd set a ring on a silver tray, and he held it like a thing entrusted rather than a thing acquired. Eleanor Whitmore, he said, I have spent my whole life lending things to people on terms. Money mostly, always on terms. Always with the security written down and the interest reckoned and the date it all comes due. His thumb moved once across her knuckles. I never once in 50 years imagined I'd hear a person offer me terms I'd take gladly. No security asked, no date. It comes due, the whole of it, resting on nothing but the choosing of it every morning. His eyes were wet now, this grave, unweeping man. Yes, to all of it. The land stays yours. The daughters inherit. The books stay separate, and the joint ones we keep together. And I will call you out. I swear it the first time I ever catch you making yourself small, though I'll tell you now, I don't reckon I'll ever have the chance, because the woman I watched walk out of that ballroom doesn't have it in her to shrink for anybody, and that's the exact thing I love about her. He lifted her hand and pressed it to his rough cheek. Have you on those terms, Eleanor? Those are the only terms in 50 years that ever made me want a thing for keeps. Yes. God. Yes, 1,000 times. They were married that autumn quietly, in the small church near the river, with Hattie standing up beside Eleanor in a new dress Eleanor had insisted on, and Silas Doyle and his recovered wife in the second pew, and Jonathan Whitmore giving his daughter away, with tears streaming openly down a face that had forgotten how to hide them, and giving her away this time to no one's plan but her own. Into no arrangement. She had not written every line of herself. Charles Beaumont did not come, of course. He never returned to Virginia. Word drifted back over the years that he had married a Philadelphia merchant's daughter, a quiet match, and gone into her father's business and lived a small, careful life far from the county that remembered what he'd done. Eleanor bore him no ill will. He had told her the truth on a river road when he didn't have to, and that one act of late and frightened honesty had given her the second of her three things, and she had meant what she'd said. She was not the sort to forget a thing like that. Old Mr. Beaumont lived out his days exactly as Eleanor had sentenced him to, keeping his house, his cotton, and his diminished name, and owing all of it to the mercy of the woman he'd tried to throw away. She never spoke against him. She never had to. The county had read the truth in his own hand, and that was punishment enough, and Eleanor found as the years went by that she thought of him almost not at all, which was perhaps the deepest mercy and the deepest justice of all, to become to the man who'd tried to erase her, simply someone who'd moved on to a larger life than he could imagine. And Vivian Carter. Eleanor thought of her sometimes on the long evenings, and hoped in a corner of her heart she did not examine too closely that the woman had found her way to one of those rare places where she did not have to perform. She never knew. Some stories you do not get to finish. You only get to wish them well and let them go. The years that followed were not without their hard seasons, for no real life is. There were bad crops and worse winters, a flood that took the low fields 2 springs running. The long grief when Jonathan Whitmore died, reconciled with his daughter. At the last the breach not fully healed but tended, which is all most breaches ever get, and more than many. But through all of it, Eleanor Ashford stood on her own ground in her own name, beside a man who had never once in all their years together decided a single thing about her future in a room she wasn't in. She became in time exactly the thing old Mr. Beaumont could never have imagined when he reckoned her as collateral in a green leather book, one of the most respected landowners on that stretch of the river. A woman whose name on a contract made Charleston buyers mind their clauses, who managed her acres and her accounts and her own affairs, with a competence that silenced the men who'd once clucked over the poor jilted Whitmore girl. She took in women over the years, women turned out by husbands, women left without means, women the county had decided were finished the way it had once decided she was finished, and she gave them work and wages and where she could a piece of ground in their own names, because she had learned the one lesson that had cost her everything to learn and was worth everything to teach, that a woman owned by no one could never be thrown away. She and Nathaniel had 2 daughters. They inherited in their own right every acre, the way Eleanor's mother had had the wisdom to leave it the way Eleanor swore on the night of her engagement to leave it. And Eleanor raised those girls to read a ledger before they could embroider, to know the worth of their own land and the value of their own word, and above all, to know bone deep before the world could ever teach them otherwise the thing their mother had nearly died not knowing. She told them the whole story when they were old enough. The ballroom, the ring on the silver tray, the walk through 300 silent people, the debt and the trust and the green ledger and the clerk who wrote the truth by candlelight. She did not soften it. She wanted them to know exactly how close she had come to being erased, and exactly what had saved her, which was not a man, and was not luck, and was not even the truth. What saved me, she told her daughters on a porch by the river 50 years after the night that nearly ended her, was that when they handed me the worst thing the world can do to a woman, when they took my future and my name and my place and stood 300 people up to watch me fall, I decided in the space of one breath that the one thing they could not take was the only thing that ever mattered. They could decide what happened to me. They could not decide what I made of it. That was mine. It was always mine. It is the one thing, my darlings, that is always only entirely yours, and no man, no debt, no ballroom full of people who've already decided you're finished, can ever take it from you unless you hand it over. So don't you ever hand it over. Not for love, not for safety, not for a roof or a name or a quiet life. You hold on to yourself, and you choose your own choosing, and you will never in your lives be anybody's collateral. Her daughters remembered those words. They taught them to their own daughters in turn on that same porch, by that same river, long after Eleanor was gone. And the land stayed in the women's names, generation after generation, never once merged away, never once pledged in a room a woman wasn't standing in. Because Eleanor Whitmore Ashford had proven with her whole hard-won life the truth that the night of her ruin had tried to drown, that a woman's worth is never granted by the man who chooses her, the family who claims her, or the society that judges her. It is hers from the first breath to the last, the one possession that cannot be sold, stolen, pledged, or thrown away, and the only one she ever truly needs to win.